All right, so group 2 is doing economic transformation, and the group was me, Brandon, Joe, and Nina Mara. So we're going to analyze the economic growth and decline of the United States from the 1870s to the current time. If you look at the United States from 1870s to 1950s, there's a huge economic transformation. It's based in industrialization, which came about in the 1870s. This led to a concentration of economic power, which came from the factories, and people who owned factories had thousands of workers, so the owners of the factories were able to make millions and millions of dollars, while the workers were left in terrible working conditions. So if you were on the top, you were way up there, but if you're on the bottom, you were way down there. So everything was going pretty good economically wise until the Great Depression, which happened in the early 1930s, late 1920s. And the Great Depression left 1 in 3 without a job, which is amazing compared to now where it's less than 5%. And the only thing that saved America from the Great Depression was World War II, when we started producing vehicles and equipment for the war. The post-World War II boom. The United States economy soared to the top after World War II. This was due to a couple of reasons. There was no damage to the country. Europe was devastated. Each country was bombed. Millions of people died. But the United States had no damage to the country. So we had an edge there. The military industry took off because there were so many factories. We were just able to produce so much. We also were set up in the Middle East with oil, so we were able to get advantage over other countries on getting oil. Then there was global military containment, which was the United States' global military effort. So instead of just focusing on our country, we were spread out around everywhere. And just to give an example, the economy grew 37% just in the 1950s, which is insane. Next slide. Okay, America 1950 compared to China now. You know how everything right now appears to be made in China? In the 1950s, even more was made in America. So if you can click on this. So right now we are in 180, and you can see that India and China had most of the advantage, which we all know. India and China were pretty much the richest countries if you do their GDP through history, and GDP is it's your gross domestic product. All right, there you go, which is pretty much the total amount of money your country makes. So if we move up to 1000 AD, we can see that India and China are still advanced, but the European countries are starting to come around. If we go to 1500 AD, European countries are starting to gain on it. If we go to the next one, they're still gaining, and then we get into imperialization of Europe, and Europe starts taking advantage, and we hit 1870 AD, and Europe is just ahead of everyone. It's at 1913. 1913, Europe is killing everyone, but the United States is starting to come around. This was before the Great Depression, but when you look at 1950, the United States, if you hover over the United States, go ahead and put your mouse on them, you can just see the United States has 27%, and the next biggest one is the blue. Yeah, the next biggest one is 15, so they almost doubled any other country, and this is multiple countries, so you need to see the huge difference there. And then if you go to now, 2008, everything seems to be made in China, but China is still less than the United States, who has been declining a lot since 1950s. So.
So while all of that happened in the United States, in the other countries, since 1950, they also experienced growth in their economy up to 1970, which is when the economy of the United States had started to decline. And you could see that the other countries, especially in Asia, experienced a rapid growth in their economies since 1970. And and you can see that the United States has been declining, and the Asian countries experienced a rapid growth. And the reason behind this would be the industrializing or the deindustrialization of the United States. Well, the countries in Asia started to produce more things, and the reason that the Asian countries experienced this rapid growth is because they started to mass produce things in and they made more companies, while the United States just stayed the same. And as you could see in the previous slide, South Korea has made a very rapid growth even compared to the other countries that experienced growth. And so a fun fact about that is that the GDP of South Korea had expanded by an average of more than 8% per year. It rose from $2.7 or $2.7 billion US dollars in 1962 to $230 billion in 1989. And how South Korea got this improvement was because the strategy they used to promote economic growth, and the strategy involved labor-intensive manufactured exports. And this was a very good strategy for the country to use because considering their poor natural resource endowment and low savings rate and small GDP or small domestic market they had, this was a very good strategy that they could have used. And this is a graph of the GDP, and you could see that it slowly rises since the 1950s, but it starts to rapidly increase since the 1970s and 1975.
So they were talking a lot about the growth of economy. So from 1970, it's the recession of the United States. The economic condition goes down. The recession was caused by energy shortage, deindustrialization, and unemployment. So that was called the 70s crisis.
Exciting.
First, the energy crisis. By the early 1970s, American oil consumption, including gasoline, and other products, was rising even as domestic oil production was declining, leading a very serious dependence on oil imported from abroad countries. Despite this, Americans worry a little about declining supply or a spike in prices, and were encouraged in this attitude by policymakers in Washington who believed that Arab oil exporters couldn't afford to lose the revenue from the United States market. So these assumptions were demolished in 1973 when an oil embargo imposed by members of Organization of Arab Petroleum exporting countries led to fuel shortages and sky-high prices throughout much of the decade. So at that time, the pumps are closed, and we can see from here, from 1970, because of the price are really high, so American cannot afford much oil to buy much oil. So oil consumption per unit of GDP declined obviously from 1970s. The industrialization. The definition of the industrialization is a process of social and economic change caused by the removal or reduction of industrial capacity or activity in a country or a region, especially heavy industry or manufacturing industry. That is the opposite of industrialization. So during the deindustrialization time, the factories collapsed and industrialization declined because of the energy shortage, and a lot of people lost jobs too. The rising unemployment. Unemployment has literally exploded in the United States during 1970s. We can see the unemployment rate is the highest at 1975. So that is the peak, and there were nearly 3 times as many unemployment Americans as there were in 1969. And like people lost their jobs, so they were voting to the government to find them another job. And here is like an interesting graph I found: the growing youth and the growing youth unemployment. That's all.
Hold 1 second.